Hello, Heather.
Hello. I'm so excited we finally got to do this.
I am too. I'm really looking forward to it. It's 7 a.m. on the East Coast of the US for me. What time is it for you?
8 p.m. over here in Singapore. You start your day, I finish mine. The
Exactly.
future looks bright, Maura. It looks bright.
I
You have
hope it's
stuff
a
to
good
look forward
day.
to.
I need a good day, Heather. I need a good day. Well, I've got my jumbo coffee here, so we're good. And
Excellent.
welcome to everyone who's tuning in live, no matter what time zone you're in. So feel free to leave a comment, ask a question, and we'll get to it. We want to obviously give this time back to you and your questions about Heather's fascinating field of study. Heather, you and I were just catching up on your expatriate life and the fact that you grew up in the US and then left the US pretty young and sort of
Yeah, I
never
was
looked back.
22, right when I graduated my undergrad. I took off to the big world. Yeah. Yeah, I was studying international studies with a focus on language and society, like a sociolinguistics, linguistic anthropology degree. And I knew I wanted to go abroad. And I also had a degree in German and spoke German pretty fluently by that point. But then I ended up taking off to Denmark to be with my boyfriend, now husband of almost 20 years. So it all ended
Oh,
up happy ending to the story.
oh, that's
But yeah, that was a
wonderful.
big jump. It was a big jump at 22 to go around the world and take that risk.
And
Mhm.
never look back. Linda
Never
says,
look
"Oh,
back.
hello, Linda. Love Heather and what she does.
Hola.
So fascinating and so needed." Yes.
Yeah.
And
Thanks, Linda.
hello from that is a British flag, I believe. Good
Mhm.
morning, Kisley. So first of all, I want to ask you that this question. We got talking because we were at Thinkers 50 in London,
Mhm.
and you've read my book, which is amazing, The
Which I
Anxious
love.
Achiever.
I think you wrote it about me. I think it's like one of those books where you're just like, oh my gosh, I feel seen.
I know.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know. If
I was completely fangirling you. I came up to you like, I just love your book. Like, I can't believe I get to meet you right now.
oh my
Yeah.
God. Well, I'm embarrassed. But first of all, thank you. Second of all, we got to talking about your work, both helping executives and companies be heard, and then your work in accent bias. And I was like, oh my God, I want to interview you.
Yeah.
What is the connection between feeling anxious at work and the work you do with people who might be experiencing a bias or stigma even about how they sound, how they present at work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, even for people who don't feel like they're experiencing a bias, just speaking up at work can be one of the most anxiety filled experiences ever.
Indeed, indeed.
So imagine, you know, being like us who speak in a pretty prestige variety of English that people don't typically look down on the way that we speak. We can go most places in the world, be understood easily. There's a lot of cultural baggage that comes along with how we speak. We're usually well respected. And to imagine every time you open your mouth, knowing that maybe they aren't going to understand me, or what if I get it wrong, or what if they don't think I'm competent, or all of these issues that come up, it increases the anxiety so much that it makes it difficult to show up and perform
Mm,
because you almost completely blank. I mean, that happens to the best of us. I mean, I know you tell a story in your book as well about having to do a big speech on stage and how terrifying it is.
yeah.
Now imagine doing it in a foreign language. Imagine doing it with a Southern accent, knowing that your colleagues just find you cute and friendly and hospitable. A friend of mine from Alabama who moved to New York to work on Wall Street and had the male dominated industry calling her Pollyanna at work because of her Southern drawl, right?
Wow.
And I mean, it's just unimaginable. You hear these stories and you think, how is that possible that people act like that? And yet they do. And it seems to be the last acceptable form of prejudice and discrimination. We seem to think it's okay to talk about the way people speak.
Mhm.
And it really isn't. And so that's where my work stems from, is to try to raise awareness around this, of what it's like to have that stigma or bias against you when you speak.
What is it what was the aha moment that led you
Hmm.
to this work? Being as you are an American, white,
Yep.
educated, sort of you've got
Mhm.
that very neutral California accent,
Yeah.
right?
I sound like Hollywood, sun-kissed beaches, all of the actors and actresses, right? And it's so funny because I just started a PhD, so I
Mm,
happened to sit in a class last week with another guy doing a PhD from California, and we're talking about our research, and he goes, "Oh, accent bias. We're really lucky that we don't really have an accent." And I just went, "Oh, yes, we do. We all have an accent. Let me make that really, really clear. We all have an accent." But we tend to believe that those of us who have the prestige accent, or the one that's considered normal or neutral, the one you hear on the news stations and in the movies, we like to believe that is not accented, but it is. It's an accent like everybody else, right? So, of course, I grew up in that world where I thought, I don't have an accent. I sound like everybody. Everyone sounds like me. And then I studied German in high school. Then I studied abroad in university. Then I moved to Denmark and learned Danish. And then I would sit. I mean, first, I had many traumatic experiences speaking German in Switzerland and Austria,
hmm,
many, too many to count. And then moved to Denmark, where I planned to spend the rest of my life before I found out we were moving to Singapore. But I planned to spend the rest of my life there. I learned Danish. I speak it fluently, very comfortable and confident in Danish. And people would stop meetings to say, "Oh, your accent's so charming." It's like, I'm sorry,
mm,
what? I'm not trying to be charming right now. We're in the middle of a meeting.
yep,
And so it's very interesting in my life. I've been in situations where when I speak in English, I'm treated one way. I have
mhm,
immediate respect. People believe I'm competent. They assume I have a high education, all of the positive traits. Then I go and I live other places and I speak foreign languages, and it's the exact opposite, where I'm having to prove myself every time I open my mouth. People talk to me like I'm a fifth grader. And I'm thinking, wow, if I was speaking English right now, you would be treating me very, very differently.
yeah,
And that was really when the aha moment came, where I thought, what about the people, the great majority of the world, who are using a foreign language every single day at work? They have
right.
to navigate the world in English. And how difficult must that be? The extra mental load, the anxiety that comes with speaking up in a foreign language, and the constant judgment and navigating that on a daily
On a
basis. This
daily
is what becomes
basis.
so tiring and so difficult.
What are the
Yeah.
colonial roots of
Mm,
this
mm,
work? You talk about prestige and,
mhm,
of course, the global dominance of English in business. I'm sure I know English isn't
mhm.
the only, but what are the colonial and you live in Singapore. What are the colonial
Yeah.
roots here at play?
Yeah, there's a lot of that. And it really does go back to that, to colonialism, to missionaries going out into the world, to the spread of English, the goal of spreading English, English being used as a weapon, really, to control populations, of segregating populations, because suddenly if you didn't speak English, you couldn't get ahead in that colonial country. And it's a huge, huge part and a foundation to not only the way people approach English globally, but also how English has become a global language of business as well. Now, to extend that personal story a step further to moving to Singapore, I've probably received the most positive reaction to my accent here. I was
Mm,
able to start a business teaching communication skills at age 26, walking into the office of CEOs and being hired because of the way I look and the way I sound. Because they would say, "I want to sound like you. How do you talk like that? How do you use your voice like that? How do you pronounce like that? I want to sound like you." There's
huh,
no way, and I'm very cognizant of this. There's no way that a local Singaporean could have started the company I started at that age and had the success that I had so early and have built what I've built. And that's truly the hypocrisy of my work, is that I'm trying to help people to fit into this world system that I don't agree they should have to change and fit into. But if I don't help them to fit in, I know they won't succeed. And then on the other side, I'm trying to educate the whole world as to look what's really happening here. And they shouldn't have to change. And why are you requiring this? Why are you looking at me like I'm so much more competent than the person next to me simply because of the way I sound? Eloquence does not equal competence, yet we're enculturated to believe so. And that's a huge problem. So the colonial roots go very deep. And in the former colonies, especially, there is still this feeling of inferiority. There is still a preference for an American or a British accent. And so this lives on, and it's embedded into our global business structures as well.
Right. It's like that internalized racism, patriarchy. I love this comment. As a non-native speaker, I get complimented a lot for sounding like a native speaker. I've grown almost to take offense at these remarks, which are really an expression of how misinformed people are on the topic. Yes.
Yeah. That's interesting. It's a really hard subject too, because it feels like a damned if you do, damned if you don't for the people who are maybe trying to navigate this and don't want to be offensive. The people who stop a meeting and say, "Oh, I love how you talk and it's so charming and I love your accent." They're truly trying to be supportive. They're impressed with my Danish. There aren't a lot of Americans who speak fluent Danish and walk into a meeting fully confident to do that. And so it's coming from a place of awe and admiration. And so they don't really understand how it could be offensive. And we see this across the board with lots of different diversity and inclusion discussions. But it can be, you have someone like our LinkedIn user who just commented, who can find it offensive because they're being compared to the native. Whereas when I was there, I hated that I was constantly being seen as other, right? Every time they pointed out my accent, or, "Oh, where are you from?" Or, "Oh, are you British?" Because they just heard an English accent, they would assume I was from the UK. And always being othered in that way was really difficult for me. I just wanted to belong. I was married into the culture. I spoke the language fluently. I had really spent years learning the culture and integrating, and then to have it constantly pointed out I was different, I would never belong. That's equally difficult. Yeah. So it's not an easy subject. And I feel like we're only at the beginning of the conversation. We had periods of time where we expected women to lean in and be like men, and we expect Black women to wear wigs or do their hair differently.
Well,
I just dream of saying those things today, right?
No. But there's a really fascinating article. I was just actually looking for it because I wanted to read a quote. Here in the U.S., if you listen to NPR, National Public Radio, our newscasters. I was reflecting on the BBC, of course, received pronunciation, and here in the U.S., there was a apocryphal story once I heard where they used to send newscasters to Minnesota because that sort of light Midwestern accent was considered, right, the norm of authority. When you think about how the voices of authority before the internet we grew up with, right, they were all white men who sounded a certain way. And Aisha Roscoe is a prominent correspondent on NPR, and she is a graduate of an HBCU, and she talked about how she sounds, quote, Black American. She doesn't have she's a Southern accent. She doesn't have a typical sort of, quote, newscaster accent.
General American. Yeah. What we call general American. Yeah.
And it's so interesting, but why is that a story? That's a story. It's a news story in the US.
Yeah, and it's a huge point of discussion in the UK as well. The BBC for many, many years required their newscasters to speak what's called received pronunciation, or the Queen's English, now King's English. And it wasn't until, I believe it was late 70s, early 80s, they officially changed that and said, we will allow regional accents on the news. But even today, it's still a conversation, because there was someone who recently was studying this and found that only about 20% of the newscasters are regional, even though they're supposedly open to all and we're very accepting. These things take a long time to change, and it is still a big conversation. And it's just funny, stuff that we would never say about other areas of diversity and inclusion, we still think it's okay to say about speech. And that's also, it hides inside of, their communication skills just aren't good enough. Or the one I get a lot here in Singapore, we need you to work with him because he just doesn't sound global enough. It's like,
Oh,
what does that
wow.
mean? What do you mean global? What? And I have to really dig and ask the question until they finally say, well, he just sounds a little too Singaporean to put out into the world. And it's like, and what's wrong with that? He is Singaporean. Your whole board of directors is Singaporean. You're a Singapore company. What the heck is wrong with that?
Well, so what the
And
yeah.
because not everyone thinks like us. Not everyone is so accepting. So unconsciously, we are hearing these accents and we're judging. We're immediately deciding how educated they sound. And we've grown up with movies where Asian accents were the butt of the joke. So it really is a hard thing to see. It's hiding in plain sight, and we don't
Yes.
even realize it's happening.
No, Stella says in addition, non-native English speakers who have invested significant effort in their university level studies often find themselves losing job opportunities to native speakers who've had no formal preparation at all.
That's extremely true in the English language teaching market globally, where job descriptions are basically, we need white Westerners, native speakers, which only include US, UK, Australia. Maybe they remember South Africa and Ireland, but sometimes not. Maybe they remember Canada is included. But the reality is there are many, many, many native speakers here in Singapore, in India, in many of the former colonies. They grow up educated in English. They are native speakers, but the world does not see them that way. And so there's a lot that needs to change in the way we talk about language as well.
Let's shift to the practical, because you do help people work within the system that represses us, which is ironic, but it's what a lot of us do. Why do people come to you? What do they say when they come to you? I just want to
it can
actually,
be
Chris Lay's
heartbreaking.
comments. I've been living in the UK for 25 years, and although my English is very good, I sometimes hear comments like that.
Yeah, it's very true. It can be very sad, the things that I hear, the stories that I hear, and the reasons people come to me. It can be as simple as, I'm tired of my kids making fun of me.
Oh, wow.
To which I get made fun of all the time by my kids when I speak Danish, believe me. So it's pretty normal for kids to do that. But it can also be a lot more serious, as in they've lost job opportunities. They've been turned down at interviews. They've been applying and no one listens to them. Or what happens more often than not is it's HR contacting me, or it's the C-suite contacting me, or someone from the board of directors contacting me saying, we want to promote this person, but this accent is standing in the way. His communication skills or her communication skills. Unfortunately, it is more often his than hers. But
that's interesting.
Yeah. And it's typically, we need him to sound more global, or because these people have to represent the company globally. We need to put them in front of the media, and people are having difficulty understanding them, or we just don't think they sound professional enough. Because remember, anything different than these prestige varieties is not going to be seen as competent or as some a sound of voice or way of speech that they want representing the firm. So those are the kinds of stories I've heard. There was an example of one woman works for a major global computer hardware company who came to me years ago and said, I designed an internal training program for a piece of software that I developed, and they wouldn't let me do the voiceover for it. So they found a white man in America to do the voiceover. And of course, everyone associated him then with that product that was developed for their internal systems. And he was the one who ended up getting credit for it, where it was all of her work. And that was when she was like, I obviously have to change something because they aren't taking me seriously. I'm missing opportunities. Other people are getting credit for my work. So there are really wide extremes of how this shows up for people and why they come to me. And sometimes it's been like very clear exclusion. People have been told, why don't you go back where you come from? Or why can't you speak English when they're clearly speaking English?
Oh my God.
And other times, though, it's couched in feedback, like maybe you could work on your communication skills or your professional presence. And they're like, I don't know what that means, Heather. What does that mean? And so,
what does presence? Presence is such a euphemism, isn't it? What does it mean?
Silly.
Yeah.
All it really means is, are you meeting the expectations of the norm that has set those expectations,
Mhm.
right? What is the people in power have decided that this is what gravitas means, this is what confidence looks like, and if you deviate from that, then you're lacking professional presence. Well, that's not entirely fair either. So I struggle a lot with these terms in my own programs, because I am there to help them have better professional presence and present well and speak well. And really what that means is helping them to navigate this bias system so that they can show up and meet the expectations of people who are living with those ideas of what a good speaker is. So it's about understanding the audience and what their expectation is, and then somehow trying to meet that. And for many of us, we may never meet that. So it's very difficult. Yeah.
Where do you I just want to show this comment by Halima.
Mm.
I don't understand these acronyms as NNESs.
Non-native English
We
speakers.
are
Mhm.
acquiring a language, and this means acquiring an accent. NESs
Of,
acquire
of
nothing. Native
native
English
English
speakers.
speakers acquire nothing. Yeah. So the non-native speaker. Yeah.
Well, so this is actually a great question.
Is a
Someone
good
from
one.
Kara, this is what I was going to ask. How do you help
Mhm.
organizations define the difference between language competency versus language
Mhm.
confidence and capability? Can you define
Yeah.
those two and then answer her question?
Yeah, there's this overlaps a little bit with things that we look at with accent, which is intelligibility versus accentedness versus comprehensibility. So intelligibility is how much do you actually understand? And in studies of intelligibility, what we would do is ask someone to write a dictation of what they're listening to. And then we actually count the words.
Mm,
How many did you get right? That's the measure of intelligibility. How much did you actually understand? Accentedness is usually done on a Likert scale, where you say that person has a very heavy accent versus no accent. And then we judge the listener's perception of how accented the person is. And then the last bit on comprehensibility, that is their understanding of how hard they thought it was to understand. So they'll also rate that as it was really hard for me to understand versus it was not hard for me to understand. And what's really interesting is that people can do a full dictation and get 100% on the dictation and then say, that was so hard to understand, I couldn't understand a word. Well, you did understand because you wrote every single word down that you heard and you got it right. So you did understand it. The problem is that, and we don't have enough research on this. We don't really know what's happening cognitively, because you
mm,
could argue, well, I'm so focused on just writing, hearing the word and writing it down, that I'm not actually comprehending and understanding what I'm writing.
right.
And that very valid argument. We just simply don't have enough. This is why I went back for the PhD. I have so many questions. We don't have the answers yet. So there's only so much that we can do. And because this is such a new field, especially within diversity and inclusion and in organizations, most have no idea that this exists. And because it's so new, the very first step is simply to raise awareness.
Mm,
That's the very first thing we can do. Accent Bias Britain is a program, a research study, multi-year study that's been going on in the UK. And they have been actually testing what can move the needle on this. And they found that really the only thing that's working right now is simply raising awareness that accent bias exists, educating people to understand where it comes from and to identify what their biases might be. We're at the foundation, step number one in this
in
process
this
here.
field of Katie says, I've received quite a bit of interesting feedback on my regional northern British accent from fellow Brits who speak more along the lines of received pronunciation, as though her accent, Katie's accent, is inferior or working class. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's across the board. I mean, all the studies will show that Accent Bias Britain, actually, I think it's .org if you wanted to go to that. It ranks and shows what everyone's thousands and thousands of people have replied, and the ranking of the attitudes towards it, which is most competent. And that West Yorkshire was actually, I think, number 2. And
Huh.
then some other northern accents. But what we look at as well is this frame of friendliness versus competence. And we see this in the United States as well. For example,
Interesting.
southern accents are seen as very, very friendly,
Yep.
but not necessarily very competent. Whereas our northern accents are very competent, but perhaps not as friendly. So it's
As a
very hard to be
Bostonian,
both.
I can I can attest to that.
Yeah.
Although we make fun, I mean, the regional Boston accent is the butt of many jokes
Many.
and Saturday Night Live
Mhm.
skits, right?
Mhm.
So it's
Mhm.
again that
Mhm.
class bias.
Yes, exactly. So you can see how intersectional it is, right? It overlaps with race, with class, education, elitism,
Yeah.
gender, sexuality. It crosses over through everything. And that's why my argument is always, why aren't we talking about this in diversity and inclusion? Why isn't it in our policies? Because it is actually foundational for everything else. The minute you hear my voice, you're making all these assumptions about, you're giving me a gender, you're guessing my age, you're
Yep.
guessing my education, you've collected all kinds of information about me from the moment you hear my voice. And then that, coupled with the fact that I am female, or coupled with the fact that maybe someone you can hear they're African American, coupled with the fact that maybe that person is homosexual, then you've decided that in your brain. Creating those categories is quite natural. It's not necessarily wrong. Where it becomes wrong is when you make decisions based on those categories you've just decided. So having that information, understanding it, knowing it, we're very good at doing that. We do it very naturally. But then, okay, do you not hire the person because of that information you just gathered from their voice? Or do you ignore them and not include them in the conversation? I mean, it's not always a spoken thing. Sometimes it's very subtle and
It's
unspoken.
very
Sometimes it's just that you avoid the person because you're scared you won't understand them. Or, and really it's just because you've shut down and you aren't trying to listen and understand.
Catherine says a non-native speaker colleague came up with the expression native splaining, like mansplaining, but where native English speakers over-explain things to her as if they assume her accent denotes a lower level of competence. Yes, I can imagine
I've
this.
been there. I've been there. That's what I mean when I say people treat me like a fifth grader when I'm in Denmark, even though I'm speaking very fluent Danish. It's very frustrating. I
And
love
Ron,
that term. I'm going to start using it.
I love it. Ron says, I'm from Houston, Texas, and I know how people in the USA think about the Texan accent. That's really
Yeah,
interesting, Ron. I mean, I think
yeah.
that people think the Texan accent, why don't you chat us what you think, what the perception is of Texan accents? I'd love to hear because you're from Texas. I'm going to, Ron also says, understandability is a word he learned from you. What does
Mm.
understandability mean?
That was probably my common term for intelligibility.
Yeah,
So how easy is it for someone to understand? What do you actually understand? It's interesting because I used intelligibility in my book Unmuted, and one of the first editors that read it said, I don't know what this word means. You need to use
yeah,
something else. Do you mean understandability? And I'm like, okay. So I think I might have fought it and kept it in the book, but because I feel like we also need to start learning the terminology and using it appropriately without overcomplicating it and making it too linguisticy. But there are subtle differences. But generally speaking, if we're looking at sort of the native, non-native divide, it's about understanding. It's about, not how it is spoken, but do you understand it or not? Can you get
right,
the job done or not? Like,
right.
if you can, then communication has been successful. We shouldn't be complaining. If you truly can't, then okay, there could be a skills gap that we need to work on. There are people who come to me who maybe never had any kind of pronunciation training. They grew up in parts of the world where they didn't have models, where truly the articulation is off, and we need to work on that. But the goal is never to sound like me or to sound like the King of England. That's not the goal, and it shouldn't be. It should be about embracing your identity, because it's at the foundation. How we speak is the foundation of who we are. And I'm so passionate about that I want to hear people's authentic voices. I don't want people to feel like they have to somehow take on some kind of American identity to succeed. Yet at the same time, I see in our world that by doing so, you may get further ahead.
Yeah.
So there we are again.
It's
What do we
it's the
do?
system. I'm going
Mhm.
to ask you a couple last questions, but I just want to throw this up. There will be an event on the 19th with students from various educational settings who are speaking about accentism.
Yay.
Yeah. If you would put the link up here because we can't see your profile. Um,
Yeah.
so
Whoever that is, reach out, let me know.
yeah, yeah. Um, talk to us about, in these just last couple of minutes, about how to get started. If you've gotten feedback, whether it's sort of a subtle dig or it's direct feedback, that the way
Mhm.
that you are heard might be holding you back, besides hiring
Yeah.
you and reading your book.
Mhm.
What do you need to think about?
I think this is also where it crosses over into a lot of your work and around that anxiety, because when you get that kind of feedback, your first reaction is to go silent. And that's what I
Mm,
see too many people do. they get that kind of feedback, and then the anxiety becomes so overwhelming that they don't want to speak up anymore, and they press mute, right? And they silence themselves, they censor themselves, and they stop participating. And that's actually the worst thing you can do in this situation, because if you have an accent, you need other people to hear it more, not less. You need to speak more and unapologetically and let people tune their ears to you, the way that you speak. And I usually say, speak up fast and early. And this is from my own experience in Denmark, where I would be very shy. I'm a totally different person in Danish, completely different. I'm so confident, so out there in English. People who meet me in Danish, I always tell them, you don't really know me if you've never met me in English. Because my whole entire personality is different. I'm much quieter. I will never raise my hand to speak. I don't volunteer to get up and talk. It's like completely different person. And so what I try to do if I go into a meeting, I try to be the first person to speak up. The minute I say something the first time and I'm still alive, nothing happened, then I'm like, okay, I can do it. I can do it, you know? The other tip I would give is to do some small talk in the beginning, knowing that they're kind of getting used to hearing you, and it's going to take 30 seconds, minute and a half, maybe longer, for them to sort of clue in if they are aware and respectful and are making the effort to understand that what they're trying to do in those first couple minutes is really just understand the way you sound. So don't get right straight to business and the important stuff. Do a little bit of the small talk and let them hear you speak. And then get into business. This happened to me a lot in Danish, where I would start speaking Danish. They'd immediately reply in English. And I'm like, no, we're speaking Danish. I can speak Danish. And I'm quite sure my Danish is better than your English. So let's just continue here, right? And I would let them sort of retune, because it usually caught them by surprise, because I look like I should be Danish. So I'm in a very different situation as well, is that physically I look like I'm a Dane. So when I don't sound like one, it's like, whoa, what's happening? And they get really confused, right? And we see that a lot. You know, a lot of people with a race, then they have a accent or speech that's different. It can get really difficult. But if you know that you have an accent that some people may not understand, then take your time to get into the conversation. Give them time to tune their ear. Keep talking. Do not go silent. Don't press mute. Keep joining the conversation. Keep speaking up. Let people get used to how you speak and the way you sound. That's the only way to move forward with it. Because if you avoid speaking and they avoid listening, we never get anywhere. And that's why we aren't hearing enough global voices. And I know that a lot of this has been focused on the non-native speaker of English, but it's just as true within the United States, within the UK, within Singapore, within India, all the different varieties of English that we speak. We have equally difficult levels of a hierarchy there about who we take seriously and not. So it's true of everyone.
Ron says when he first moved to New York, he was afraid to tell people he was from Texas because they might think he was slow and backward. Wow. And Krista, and I'm sorry, Krista, I'm probably mispronouncing your name, says I had a person suggest me to change my name so I could be invited to job interviews.
Yeah, that's another. I mean, we have tons of research on that one, right? That people who use the nice white Western name are going to be called into the interview before others. And without even hearing your voice yet, they've already assumed what it's going to sound like.
Right. The bias. Sandrine, accent bias can also stem from an untrained ear, particularly among individuals in the US, who may not have traveled internationally. English speakers across Asia and Europe, despite their wide range of accents, often manage to understand each other quite well. But arriving in the US, well, we know that the percentage of people in the US who have passports is very low, right? Compared to a lot of other countries. We are the ultimate privilege group here in the US, where we think everyone needs to sound like us.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because usually when groups of non-native speakers or people who speak it as their first, second, third, fourth, fifth language, when they come together, they tend to understand each other better than when the American or the Brit walks in the room. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I mean, when we communicate, when we're abroad, unless we're very aware, we're speaking very quickly. We're using a lot of idioms and cultural expressions. We're dropping these cultural markers into our speech, assuming that everyone should know them because, well, we're speaking English, and if you speak English, you should know this. But actually, so much of what we say comes from baseball, football. I mean, you name it. We have so many sports analogies and things that we do. Whereas non-native speakers, when they come together, they realize that they are all using a foreign language, and they're giving space for each other. They know how to accommodate to each other. They recognize where people's vocabulary levels are. They go slower. They check for understanding more often. They do all the things that we do when we learn foreign languages. Now, the problem is when English speakers who go out in the world and have never learned a foreign language, especially, I would say the biggest difference I see are between monolingual speakers and people who speak multiple languages. Usually those who have learned foreign languages navigate this a lot better.
Right.
But monolingual English speakers usually have no concept of the struggle and difficulty and how to slow down, or how to recognize where the vocabulary level is, or how to even check for understanding, or to recognize on the person's face if they are understanding or not. I mean, there's so much happening very subtly.
Well, but it's privilege, right? It's the same thing as walking, me as a privileged white woman in America, walking into a grocery store and expecting that, no one's ever going to assume that I have any ill purpose in there. I mean, I think the thing that your work has done, and for me and thousands of other people, is that this is probably not new where you live, but for me in America, this is something that also because we pretend there's no class in America.
Right.
Of course, in Britain, I think I've loved My Fair Lady and have seen it many times on Broadway.
Yes, I know it's one of my favorites. Of course,
it's your favorite. What is My Fair Lady about? Yes. Exactly. Rob says, I did the opposite. I had to lose the Boston accent to live in Tennessee. Very funny, Rob. I'm curious what they thought of your Boston accent. I'm from New Jersey, so you can hear me when I say Boston. It comes back. Although, of course, a New Jersey accent in the US, people think you're in The Sopranos. And so I was it was sort of beaten out of me, actually, when I was in school, to have a more sort of neutral East Coast accent than the regional Boston coffee.
Yeah, coffee talk. Yeah, I love it. But that's what's interesting, right? Like, you were taught that. And I think that's what we have to remember. It's our teachers, it's our parents. How many times your mom said, we don't say it like that, or, which I had one of those moms. So that's why I say that. That's not how we say it, and the movies we watched, the Disney films, the accents that are used in Disney, it's scary if you start to think about it. The stuff we grew up on, right? The Simpsons. Sure. The way the voices are
and
chosen,
racist.
the accents. Yes, very extremely. And it's everywhere in our films, in our media, in our, schooling, everywhere. It's everywhere. Once you open your eyes to this, you're like, oh, it's everywhere. you can't not see it anymore.
You can't unsee it. Yeah. Or have big hair. Thank you, Rob. Yes, people in New Jersey have big hair. Yes. There's such an amazing conversation here. Daniel Kahneman talks about the fact that we are lazy listeners. Yes.
Exactly. It's exactly that.
I want to throw up the link to the free session. I think this is it, Kirsten. Is this the session? Join our free webinar.
This is Kirsten. Yeah.
On the limits of native speakerism, with a bunch of acronyms that I can't pronounce.
International Association of Teachers of English as a Foreign Language, Business English Special Interest Group. Luckily, I do know what we're talking about.
I think with this conversation,
obviously a very important topic and conversation for the English teaching community, because it has a lot to do with how English is being taught in the classroom, how teachers are presenting it to the students, how we choose language models for what is correct pronunciation. These are really big challenges that they're faced with, as well as the whole native speaker issue in hiring. So I think that's why we have a lot of teachers here today.
Well, I have to get my kids to school, so I do have to cut this off here on the East Coast. But Heather, I just want to thank you so much. Zana says, you're so right, Heather. This is an important debate: accent bias and linguistic injustice Linguistic
Yeah.
injustice is very real, and EDI needs to focus. Yes,
Mhm.
could not agree more. Heather, where should people come find you if they want to know more?
You'll probably find the most about the accent work I do on heatherhansen.com. So that's my author website. So if you want to learn more about Unmuted and the book I'm writing now on accent bias, that's where it is. But of course, LinkedIn is probably the best, most up-to-date place where I hang out. And I like to post about this a lot. And I'm so happy that we've started this conversation. And thank you for giving me the platform to discuss it with you. This has been great.
Oh, this has been fantastic. Thank you for opening my ears and sorry, that was cheesy. And many other people's. I hope you have a great night.
Thank you. Have a great day. Get those kids
Thanks,
to school. And
everyone.
thanks everybody for joining.
Thanks. Bye-bye.